afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Gabriela Lopez, Director of the Research to Practice Measures at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. This last year, our collective experience and observation of the deep inequities in our educational system have allowed for transparent conversations about the systemic challenges our children and families are faced with in our communities. The importance of diversity and equity in ensuring a just education system has been a calling for many of us who have spent years working in service of building a system that humanizes Black, Brown, and Indigenous youth and their families. Measurement and metrics are one of the tools used to codify how we define student, classroom, and school success. These tools have historically been used to cement and perpetuate inequities and deficit narratives of Black, Brown, and Indigenous youth. During this moment in the history of our education system, we have the opportunity and responsibility to reimagine what it means to have measures and metrics that disrupt existing patterns of inequity with tools that humanize and see the brilliance of Black, Brown, and Indigenous youth. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Dr. Jennifer Randall and Dr. Ezekiel Dixon-Roman, two experts in measurement, each who have been working at the intersection of measurement, culture, and policy, as well as diligently supporting the diversification of the measurement field. Thank you both for joining me today. Will you share a bit about yourselves and your work? Jennifer, we'll start with you.
Hi, Gabby. I'm very pleased to be here with you all today. I am an associate professor in the Research, Educational Measurement, and Psychometrics program at UMass in Amherst. There, I'm also the Director of Evaluation Services for our Center for Educational Assessment, and I also serve as the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs for the College of Education there at UMass. In addition to that, I am a founding board member for Women in Measurement, which is an organization founded to advance gender and racial equity in the field of educational measurement. And before I found myself in the field of measurement, I was actually a high school social studies teacher. And much of the research and scholarship that I do now is really stems from that time as a high school teacher. And I focus now primarily on thinking about the ways in which small scale assessments, which include classroom assessments, of course, and large scale assessments, have a negative differential impact on historically marginalized students, so those Black, Brown, and Indigenous students that you spoke of earlier. And how can a culturally sustaining and anti-racist approach to assessment help to mitigate some of those negative outcomes for those students?
Thank you, Gabby, for the introduction and for giving us a nice framing for this conversation today. I'm Ezekiel Dixon-Roman, as you've already mentioned. I'm associate professor at the University of Pennsylvania in the School of Social Policy and Practice. I'm also director of our Master of Science in Social Policy program, chair our Data Analytics for Social Policy certificate program. And I'm also one of three directors of the Institute in Critical Quantitative, Computational, and Mixed Methodologies. While my background is in the social sciences and psychometrics, I do work in cultural studies of quantification and critical theories of difference. Much of my work is focused on the study of the technologies and practices of quantification and the ways in which power is regenerating difference in and through those very technologies and practices of quantification. And this includes everything from educational testing to the use of AI and machine learning in various areas of governance and public policy.
Thank you both. Jennifer, if you'll take this question, we're now 1 year into the COVID-19 pandemic, and we've seen numerous reports of the impacts of the pandemic on Black and Brown youth and communities. Given our reliance on assessments and measures to give us a signal about how youth and communities are doing, what needs to be tackled in educational measurement to disrupt inequities?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Gabby, for that question. So I see a few places where we can tackle some of these issues in our field. One, I think the first thing we need to do moving forward is move towards a system where we move to sustain and affirm the ways of knowledge, understanding, experiencing the world of Black and Brown and Indigenous students and their families, really relying on, calling on those cultural funds of knowledge to inform our assessment development process and interpretation of the results of those assessments. So really moving away from what I call a white-centered approach to assessment and moving into a system of assessment where the funds of knowledge and understanding of all students, particularly students of color and historically marginalized students who have been erased in the past, is really valued. And to me, that's critical in terms of a first step. I also think as a field, in service to that, it would be helpful for us to get over our obsession with standardization. Um, the former president of NCME gave a talk a while ago, his presidential address, and one of the things he talked about us needing to do is to move away from this obsession where we think all assessments have to be exactly the same and students have to experience them in exactly the same way. I mean, those really represent old values, colonial values around assessment. And as we move forward into a world and into a country, in our case, where it is increasingly more diverse, and the way people experience the world, understand the world, gain their own knowledge, construct their own knowledge, is not standardized. So to be obsessed with this standardized test movement, it's time we move past that. We have absolutely got to get past that. And then finally, I'll say one thing that I think we need to work on as a field is we need to stop allowing um, policymakers, individuals, the dominant class to use us as a field to control Black and Brown bodies, right? To use assessments to, whether they be educational assessments that are tied to graduation, tied to promotion, tied to whatever number of benefits there are, or also tied to whatever number of punishments there are, using educational assessments to do that, and using affective or psychological assessments also to control Black bodies, right? So much of the work around self-regulation and socio-emotional learning is really, those assessments are really about how well can you control this child's Black body in this space so that it acts more like a white body. So I think for me as a field, if we can do those three things, we will be making progress. The last thing I want us to do is the thing I want Ezekiel actually to talk about, because I know he articulates it so much better than I do, but it's a recognition of the history of assessment and the system of oppression. So Ezekiel, I know you may want to say other things, but I really want you to talk about the haunting in your remarks.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. First of all, overall for your comments, period. But also because I think you're right on point and everything you just shared. Also, thank you, Gabi, for the framing for this question and situating it in COVID-19. Because there's a way in which we can often think easily about educational measurement as being somewhat distinct and separate from even the pandemic in and of itself. I'm gonna sort of pivot and try to make a connection to the haunting that that Jennifer is alluding to, and I think I want to sort of use the trope of apocalypse here, and as a way of understanding apocalypse as that which we as the thing we call a human, is about really the fear of the end of the world, and that apocalypse is really fundamentally in its etymology always about a revealing, uncovering of something. And in fact, that very idea of the fear of the end of the world actually can be traced back in history of philosophy and even to the age of reason. But basically, where science emerges, science and empiricism emerge as a form of reason, form of instrumental reason, to try to understand that which the human does not know, is uncertain about. That is the natural world in particular. So where measurement science then comes in is, how do we actually quantify and produce information about that which we don't know? And in fact, what we get, and through the pandemic, and then through COVID-19 are these very practices to do that in order to allay our fears, in order to control that which we don't understand, that which we don't know, that which we're uncertain about. That same practice gets deployed on students, on bodies, on Black and brown bodies in particular. And what in fact then occurs is the very maintaining of a logic of whiteness that's designed into the instrumentation. Jennifer, I so appreciate your use. You're referring to self-regulation and socio-emotional constructs, I'm going to characterize, that then get designed into instruments to, one, measure whiteness as a way of identifying who is performing and behaving under the logic of whiteness and who is not, who's the indeterminate, who are the bodies that are indeterminate to that logic. And then it becomes, how do we deploy practices pedagogically, whether it even could be by way of social work and mental and behavioral practices, behavioral therapeutic practices, in order to regulate those bodies to back to the norm. Or, of course, there's the other logic. If we cannot bring those bodies into the homogeneity or into the sameness of logics of whiteness, then it becomes, what are the other practices that can be deployed to control those bodies and maintain them into particular positions, into particular trajectories of life, including one of the more extreme of this is the school to prison pipeline, or the carceral state, right? And so I so appreciate you bringing this up, because I think you are right on point, especially in the notion of self-regulation, because self-regulation actually comes out of the history of understanding the human as a self-determining subject. Well, in the history of philosophy, who can be a self-determining subject actually was the European. It was not those of the global South. It was not Black and brown bodies. Black and brown bodies actually were understood to be affectable. Were understood to be primitive and close to nature. So I think it's really important that we, one, understand these logics, understand how measurement, even psychometrics in particular, is doing the work to maintain those logics. But then, how do we undo them? How do we undo them, to rework them, to reimagine them toward developing mechanisms, practices, technologies of measurement that is fundamentally about affirming, enabling, affirming and enabling, I was looking for another word, the multiplicity of ways of being and knowing in the world. I'll stop on that, but thank you, Gabi, for the wonderful question, and also Jennifer for such a great lead into this conversation.
Absolutely, thank you both. And so as we think about measurement in education and all of the wonderful points you've made, historically, the measurement field clearly has been predominantly white and predominantly male. And you're both working to diversify the field of measurement, because we know representation is an important piece of the puzzle. But we also know that representation is not enough. What else do we need to address in educational measurement to build tools that support a humanizing education experience for youth within this comprehensive education system? Ezekiel would love to hear from you, your thoughts.
All right, thank you. I think, obviously this is another really important question. I mean, I think there's a way in which we emerge out of a politics, particularly out of civil rights, I would say, era and movement that has focused so much on representation. There's a way in which policy, civil rights legislation, has focused us on a politics of representation in order to try to shift not just the demographics, but society. But there's been a huge assumption in that, and that the assumption there is that all of those bodies that are sought to be brought to the table, if you will, are somehow supposed to magically transform the logic and the norms of that table. And in fact, what ends up happening is the logic and norms maintain the same, even while those others are brought to the table, and they're just expected to perform to it. But I don't want to downplay the importance of representation, right? So let me say, as a PhD student that was in one of few psychometrics programs in the country that still exist in departments of psychology, let alone at the time that I knew of a handful of us that were of color that were coming through such programs. And I know Jennifer also was coming through her program at similar time. There were few mentors that were of color in the field. While I had my questions, especially my critical theoretical questions I was bringing to psychometrics, even at the time I was wrestling with, especially critical race theory, but also more broadly critical theories of difference. There was not that mentor that can help me think through how psychometrics and these critical theories of difference in particular could be thought together, let alone be put in conversation. I was lucky enough to have an advisor to encourage me to find mentors outside the field. But I think it's that that aspect of representation, it does become deeply important. So who is there when I get to this program, when I get to this place, that whether they're mentoring me or not, could be even a model for me to actually follow behind and help me to navigate the space itself. Now, one of the things that I'm working on with others in and through the Institute for Critical Quantitative Computational Mixed Methodologies, one of our first objectives is to actually diversify the field of critical data science. We recognize, in fact, Otis Johnson and myself were on the selection committee for the AERA Dissertation Fellowship Award or Dissertation Grant Award. And we recognize, of all those applicants, the number that were quantitative were extremely few. I mean, I want to say it might have been like 20 out of, like, say, the 200 or 300 applications there were. It was extremely small number, and we were blown away by this. So one hand, we initially began to talk about why this might be. Yeah. What are the conditions? What are the contexts? What's going on in programs where this might be the case? But then secondly, what are the further implications, especially if we understand that quantification, statistics, measurement, computation are very much so part of a dominant discourse in the policy world. So if we're not engaging in it, what does it mean for the implications for how we're able to shift the very discourse of power? So we developed this institute as a way to try to create alternative approaches to developing and diversifying the field of critical data science, because we recognize it's not happening necessarily in departments across the country and PhD programs across the country. More importantly, what we also recognize is that statistics, measurement, quantitative methods courses, as well as how would you call them, like online platforms for conversation, for information and all, they can be hostile to us. They can be hostile to especially critical theory, critical race theory type of questions. And so we wanted to create an opportunity and space that was affirming, enabling, and even showing how to do this work. Last thing I'll say, and this is a more of a broader sort of comment that goes beyond representation, and that really is more about the not enough. So I'm reminded of a New York Times article that recently came out that features an Afro-Dominican professor at Princeton University in classics, and they're in this article they talk about specifically how this Afro-Dominican professor, that much of his work has been about literally deconstructing the very foundations of classics, and why? Because for him, his argument is that classics have been at the very foundation of the project of whiteness. And so as far as he's concerned, his argument has been such that we need to go after either completely doing away with classics or reimagining and redefining it anew in a way that is not about reaffirming the very logics of whiteness, but actually trying to open up classics in ways that that captures the sensibilities and ways of knowing and of the global South and other parts of the world. I actually think psychometrics has a similar problem.
Mm.
I actually think psychometrics literally in its very origins was very much so about whiteness. Remember, the very person, the very scholar that created the very term psychometrics is the same person who coined the term eugenics, Francis Galton. And so when we think about the foundations of psychometrics also being grounded in whiteness and also being part of the very colonial Enlightenment project of documenting identity and difference around the world, mental differences around the world, then what does it suggest about the developments of measurement and its other partner of assessment, and what we fundamentally need to do? So I actually think, similar to this Afro-Dominican professor's intervention in classics, I actually think we need a similar intervention in psychometrics that's going after its foundations to fundamentally redefine what measurement is and what measurement does.
Thank you, Ezekiel.
Yes. Thank you, Ezekiel, for those comments. They're really thoughtful. And as I think about what you're saying here, I was also thinking, in the field of measurement, as we think about representation, I mean, you're so right. So it's important to have Black and brown bodies at the table, if for no other reason than for them to share their narratives, right? Like we talk about this in critical race theory about the importance of sharing narratives and counter narratives, and really Black and brown bodies talking about their experiences and making those experiences known. So it's critically important to increase that representation. I appreciate the work you're doing with your institute. And at the same time, recognize that there's this fundamental underlying commitment to whiteness and white supremacy beneath the field of measurement. And so even as we increase the number of Black and brown bodies and Indigenous bodies in the field, we also need to be at the same time raising the critical consciousness of the entire field. And that has to be a part of our representation piece. In a recent study I conducted with a Hispanic colleague of mine, Joseph Rios at the University of Minnesota, we actually did a full curriculum review of educational measurement and psychometric programs, broadly speaking. So it included many quant psych programs as well. And in that review of the curriculum, of course, we paid attention to what measurement courses were being required and statistics courses and policy courses. But of course, we looked at courses that focused on diversity and inclusion or social justice, or courses that focused on the history of measurement and assessment so that students would know about this kind of this commitment to whiteness that has always been held. And we found the mode to be zero and looking across these courses. So, I mean, representation in addition to being about the bodies has to also be about the content that's being represented in the field. And the content that we're representing is not moving us forward as a field. It's not raising our critical consciousness in our doctoral training program. So even if you're fortunate enough to have this kind of threshold of Black and brown bodies enrolled in your program, what content are they receiving? And what content are the white bodies receiving in these spaces? So I think it's important that we also think about that. And then also do the work of recruiting people into the field, of also making this field known to those BIPOC individuals so that they can take up this banner with us and what I like to say, fight the good fight. And looking at, with Joseph Rios, NSF data for 20 years, from 97 to 2016, trying to look at the trends of who were we graduating from these programs. Again, broadly speaking, if I were teaching my research methods course, I would say that our sampling frame was way overrepresented, but we wanted to be sure if it was possible for anyone to graduate with a degree and work in educational measurement or psychometrics, we were capturing them. And if at the end, in order to report our data, we couldn't even disaggregate by Black and Hispanic separately. We had to combine those two groups because there were so few students. And we couldn't do anything with the Indigenous students. I don't think we even could have added them up over the whole 20 years, much less year by year. to report those statistics. So while we work on raising our critical consciousness, while we work on changing our content, we do, in fact, still need to also be working on recruiting Black and Brown and Indigenous bodies into the field.
Yeah, thank you both. The call is there, and this clearly influences and impacts our educational system, because this is the human capital that is working to develop new measures and metrics. And so it's definitely a call for us. This last question, this moment in time has disrupted our education measurement system that policymakers, school administrators, and families rely on. What is the reimagining that needs to happen to ensure we are moving toward a humanizing system that centers historically marginalized communities? Jennifer, will you kick us off?
Sure. Actually, I think this is incredibly, in addition to being difficult time, an incredibly exciting time, really post-COVID. And for me, it's because we have the opportunity for a reset in educational measurement and in an educational assessment. Quite frankly, in addition to being obsessed with standardization, what I talked about before, we are also obsessed with trend in our field. Just so committed to trend and never breaking trend. So, our assessments have to have so much overlap in them in order to maintain that trend, which of course maintains that standardization and maintains the white centeredness of it. But now, in 2020, I think large scale state assessments pretty much went out the window. And quite frankly, what we're going to have in 2021 is not anything that anyone would, in their good, with their right mind, would say would be reliable or an appropriate measure of what's happening in schools given our last year. So we're going to have to reset anyway. Why not reset in the right direction? Why not reset in a way that de-emphasizes standardization and emphasizes culturally sustaining and anti-racist approaches to assessment? We have this opportunity. We've broken trend. So let's take advantage of this broken trend and really start to develop assessments that speak to the communities that are subjected to these assessments, right? So why not call on the funds of knowledge of the students, of their families, and the way that we develop our assessments? Why not try to make our assessments actually do something, be anti-racist, actually inform, actually disrupt, actually be explicit about the history of structural racism and oppression in this country? Why not, now that we have this opportunity, do that work? And then these assessments will be more meaningful to parents and students. And they'll engage in them because the information that they get from them on those score reports, and this information doesn't even have to be numbers, but I know that may be too radical for people. But the information that they get on these score reports is actually information that matters to them, right? So they can say, hey, this is what we value. This is what we want you to know. This is how we understand and operate in the world as a community. And this is what you're being assessed on. You should be paying attention to this. All right. You need to be taking this assessment seriously. And then those trends might actually mean something for Black and Brown and Indigenous students, other than just an opportunity to tell a deficit narrative about Black and Brown and Indigenous students, which is what they've been used for in the past. And I think in order to do this, assessment's going to have to figure out a way to be a little more agile, right? Because we know that culture is fluid and it changes and it shifts. And in educational assessment, we don't like shifting out quickly, right? Like if you think about the standards for psychological and educational tests, when I came into the field, they were 1999. And then we changed them in 2014, and I don't hear anybody talking about changing them again. So in the field, we like to stay pretty static. But I think if we want to be meaningful, if we want to have an impact in communities, and for people to not just see us as a barrier to their hopes and to their dreams and to their aspirations, for them to see us as useful and meaningful and actually a signal to what's actually happening in their communities in a way that they want to know, then we move forward. Then it feels like we are doing good work in the field.
Thank you both. We are at time, and thank you for this wonderful conversation and lots to think about and inform. our educational systems. So grateful for your brilliance in the world, and look forward to many more conversations. And thank you everybody for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you. This
you.
was fantastic, fun,
Yes,
great.
yes, it really was. Thank you.